Here's how I built an airbrush spray booth. Start with a kitchen exhaust hood and pull out the fan, the switches, and the light. And after removing the switches, the bulb, and the fan, you also need some ducting, an exhaust cap, and some wiring. Here's my setup to make sure that the light and fan works before putting it together. Yep, the light worked. And the fan worked too, at both speeds. Since I have a casement window, I had to block it with something. I used a scrap piece of plexiglass to cut to size. Cutting the plexiglass wasn't too hard. I used a fine blade normally intended for metal, and it worked okay. Just go slowly, otherwise the plexiglass heats up and reseals itself. Also on the parts list was a filter and the plexiglass piece that I cut, as well as an optional piece of insulation for the plexiglass. That's pink insulation. Finally, the container for the exhaust hood. Here's the container before I cut a hole in the bottom with the knife, and after with duct tape reinforcing where the screws go through. This is looking at the fan mounted from the inside and then from the outside. Here I am, cutting the hole in the side of the fan housing for the exhaust duct. This is how the housing fits over the fan. Duct tape will seal it up. I cut some holes in a box to hold the switches and allow wiring access. The hole was tight enough to allow me to screw the fitting into place for the wiring access. And the switches fitted snugly into the holes in the box as well, just a push fit. The switches for the light and fan have been installed in this box. Time to wire the switches to the fan and light. Because I had to add a ground wire to the fan, I had to remove some insulation from it in preparation for connecting it to the ground wire in the plug. The wires leading from the fan are shown here, attached to the switches. Now all the wires are in place for the switches, the light bulb, the fan, and power supply. Here's the box mounted on the side of the spray booth. Next I rigged up some supports for the fan housing, using some scrap metal brackets since it has to hold the weight of the duct. I just bent a couple of scrap right-angle brackets to fit. I used some insulation as a spacer to hold the filter support away from the fan at the back of the bin. Then I trimmed some scrap board to fit inside the bin and hold the filter in place. I drilled holes in order to cut out the center of the boards with a jigsaw. With the centers cut out and small bolts installed to hold the boards together, you can see how the filter is sandwiched. So with the foam spacer installed, I then installed the back plate of the filter holder. I used nuts, bolts, and washers to hold the back plate against the foam spacer. Make sure the nuts and bolts are wide enough apart so they don't interfere with the installation of the filter. I trimmed the filter to fit, cutting a 16 by 25 inch filter in half. It worked well. I cut with a sharp blade and straight edge and did a test fit. Then I installed the front filter holder with the two bolts sticking out. These are actually plastic toilet seat nuts and bolts, which have been thoroughly cleaned. At this point, the box was mostly done. I'm probably going to replace the light with an LED strip. Now to cut a hole for the exhaust duct in the plexiglass window insert. Again, I used a jigsaw with a fine-toothed blade, used usually for metal. You can also use a blade specifically designed for plexiglass. And the duct fits pretty nicely. Next, I had to make some supports to hold the plexiglass in the window opening. I took some scrap pieces of metal and made small levers to do the holding. I ended up with something simple, but it worked. They just swing down and hold the plexiglass against the window frame. I just needed a couple of holes drilled in the plexiglass for these metal holders. One on each side. The bolt comes through the plexiglass and the plate rotates into place. I added a bit of tape to protect the window frame from getting scratched. I needed to drill holes to install brackets to hold the exhaust duct in place against the plexiglass. Then holes in the plexiglass for the other side of the bracket. Here, the brackets and exhaust are installed in the plexiglass with nuts, bolts, and washers. Seal the gap between the duct and plexiglass with tape. More custom brackets were made to hold the exhaust duct to the fan manifold. I added some old window insulation I had lying around to reduce any draft between the plexiglass and the window. Now time to test the setup by opening the window and inserting the plexiglass. I had previously removed the inside screen. I pushed the plexiglass against the window flange and twisted the locks to hold the plexiglass in place. Now, time to set up the exhaust hood and connect the ducts. I just needed to connect the two tubes together with some flexible ducting. A bit of cutting and 2 hose clamps later, and I had it set up. I realized that I could leave the duct connected and lay the plexiglass down on the hood when it isn't in the window, so this is how I set it up to use it. Here's a short demo using the airbrush. I used a black Liquitex ink so I didn't dilute it. Shook it a bit and put a few drops in the top of the airbrush. Sorry, I'm blocking the view. I turned on the exhaust fan and it worked. You push down for air and pull back to supply paint. I took an old tea canister and separated the glass top from the plastic seal, with the idea that the airbrush could be inserted in a hole in the plastic and get rid of the excess paint or cleaning fluid. I measured the diameter of the airbrush and cut a hole for it in the plastic cap. The airbrush fit pretty snugly into the top. Then I cut a hole in the top to allow air to escape. A filter over the hole will collect spray particles. I just used some paper towel to cover the hole in the top and to allow air to escape. Several layers would be good. You could also use a piece of fabric or filter paper. A bit of tape to hold the paper in place over the hole. So I tested the airbrush in the new top. And it fits snugly. And the glass top can be used to seal it up after cleaning to contain the cleaner and paint until after you dispose of it. Cleanup using the cleaning pot was fairly straightforward. Just pour some cleaning solution, I'm using windshield wiper fluid, into the airbrush. Swirl it around and use a swab to clean it as best you can and pour it out into the cleaning pot. Do that a couple of times and then spray some fluid through the airbrush into the cleaning pot. Seal the top, insert the airbrush, and spray. Empty out the airbrush by spraying it in the booth. I also took it apart and fully cleaned it and dried it as well. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you build an airbrush booth and airbrush cleaning pot.